Hello, in this video, I'm going to talk about quantitative survey methodology. Quantitative surveys can provide a quantitative description of trends, attitudes, or opinions of a population, among other things. Surveys can test for associations and not causation. So we can find just relationships among variables in surveys, which could be the foundation to do further research to look for causation beyond just correlation or association, which we can find through surveys. So when we're designing a survey study and we're writing our proposal, you want to provide a purpose for using survey research. So why are you deciding to use a survey as your methodology as opposed to other types of study design that you could be using? So you need a purpose for using a survey. And why is that survey method preferred over the many other options we have in research design? Then you want to specify what is the specific type of survey design that you plan to use. So are you going to administer a survey at one point in time, and that would be a cross-sectional design? Or do you plan to administer maybe the same survey multiple times with the same population over time? Or maybe it's a series of different surveys over time, and that would be, both of those examples would be longitudinal. So when you're collecting data over time using surveys, that's longitudinal, compared to cross-sectional, where you're just collecting survey data one time, and that's a cross-sectional design. You also want to specify how you're going to administer that survey. So are you going to call people on the phone and ask them the questions verbally? Are you going to send the surveys in the mail? Are you going to email the surveys to your participant group? Are you going to do it in person and hand it out on paper and they complete it there in front of you? So you want to specify how you are planning to collect the data using the surveys and give a justification for why that method is appropriate for your population and your subject. So in some cases, it works great to send an electronic survey via email. And in other cases, it might be preferred to give the survey verbally, like on the phone or in person, because maybe there's a question of literacy or there's an issue with language barriers or anything like that. Then you might want to give it verbally. Or maybe it's a group that you see in person on a regular basis, and you might get better participation if you hand it out to them in a group setting when you're going to see them and administer it that way. So there should be some rationale behind what type of way you decide to administer your survey. So you need to identify the population that you are going to survey, and that includes the size and the sampling frame. So like the population, for example, could be patients with breast cancer. So that's a broad population that includes people around the world, but your sampling frame would be the members of that population that you actually have access to and are potentially going to sample. So maybe the whole population is patients with breast cancer, and that includes people all over the world, but your sampling frame might be patients with breast cancer who are seeking care or receiving care from a certain facility or a certain healthcare system or something like that, depending on what you have access to. So you want to specify the population and the sampling frame where you are going to draw your sample from. You need to specify the sampling design. So is it a single stage, a simple sample, or is it multi-stage, or also called clustering, where you might take the population within your sampling frame and divide it into smaller groups and then draw a sample from each smaller group. You also need to specify whether you're using probability or non-probability sampling. So probability is randomized selection from your sampling frame. And it's preferred when it's possible because it allows you to make strong statistical inferences about the population, because you can calculate the likelihood of a member of that population being sampled. So it's statistically stronger, but it logistically is not always possible depending on the nature of your study, who you're studying, what you're studying. And so in that case, you would need to use non-probability sampling, where participants are selected subjectively. So the researcher might be subjectively selecting participants depending on availability or convenience, or they need to volunteer. You might not be able to randomly select from your sampling frame because you might need to just accept whatever volunteers want to participate. So there are limitations that can make truly random selection difficult. And so non-probability sampling, you can't calculate the likelihood of that participant being selected because they were selected subjectively. So it's statistically less sound. Statistically, we can't make the same kind of inferences about the population, but sometimes that is the only way to do it, depending on your study design and your population. Then you need to indicate if you're going to involve stratification in your sampling. So in some cases, you might want to, it might be important to make sure that certain demographic groups are represented adequately in your sample. And if that's the case, then you might want to stratify so that you have different strata representing certain characteristics that you want to make sure are represented. So that could be like gender, socioeconomic status, language, different things where you want to make sure that you're getting adequate representation of different parts of the population. So you'll need to indicate the number in the sample and the procedures that you use to determine how many you need in your sample. So you'd use a power analysis while you are planning all of your procedures if you're trying to detect associations. So if you are trying to find associations between different variables that you're measuring in your survey, then you need a power analysis to statistically determine how many participants you need in your sample to be able to draw statistically significant conclusions once you've collected your data. So in a power analysis, it would involve estimating the size of correlation. You'd estimate an alpha value, which would be the null so the alpha value is telling you about the likelihood of having a type 1 error rate. And so a type 1 error would mean that the null hypothesis is rejected when it shouldn't be. The beta value is telling you the likelihood of having a type 2 error rate, which would mean the null hypothesis is accepted when it shouldn't be. And you conduct your power analysis. Okay, so that needs to be done while you are planning your study so that you know how many individuals that you need in your sample. Okay, so instrumentation. The easiest way to proceed is to work with a survey instrument that already exists. So the more an instrument has already been used, the more evidence there will be of its validity and reliability, which is really important when it comes to interpreting your results of your study, and being able to accept those results and knowing that they're believable and relevant and valid results. So using an instrument that already exists and has been used before is the path of least resistance. It's the easiest route to take. If an instrument does not exist that measures the constructs or the variables that you intend to measure, then certainly develop your own. But if you develop your own, then you need to have a plan in place for pilot testing and determining the validity and reliability of that instrument. And so you would want to pilot test and determine those qualities before you then use that instrument with your whole population. So let's say we're using an instrument that already exists. You would start by naming the instrument. So state what instrument you plan to use. You would give credit, of course, to where that instrument originated. Depending on the instrument, you might need permission from the original creator of that instrument. So it could be copyrighted and somebody might own the right to use that instrument. So always go to the original author and ask for permission. Generally, most authors will give permission with the stipulation that you assign credit, that you give them credit in your manuscript and your proposal, that you give credit and say, here's this instrument and here's who developed it. But you might need permission. In some cases, some instruments are open use for, depending on who developed it. So there are different like government organization developed instruments and things like that that might be open and available without permission. So make sure you consider that. You want to describe the established validity scores based on its past use. So again, that's the major benefit of using an instrument that already exists and has been in use, is that there will be established statistics about its content validity, construct validity, and its concurrent validity. So you want to discuss that. You want to describe those validity scores based on what you can find in the literature. Same goes for reliability. So describe the reliability scores based on its past use. So you want to describe internal consistency and the test-retest reliability. And again, if you develop your own instrument, you can still test all of these things, but you need to do that by designing a pilot study that then has to take place before you use your instrument with the broader population. Because if you don't, then you can't be sure that when you use your brand new instrument with your larger study with your population, you can't be sure that the results that you receive in the end are valid or reliable because you haven't tested the instrument that you developed. When modifying or combining instruments, the validity and reliability that you find in the literature may not hold. Okay, so you always have to consider, let's say you're going to use an existing instrument and maybe you want to modify it to add a question, take away a question that's not relevant to your study, or you want to combine a couple of instruments to make sure that you're hitting all the different marks of what you're trying to measure. Or maybe you're keeping the instrument the same and using it with a completely different population that the instrument has not been tested with before, then the original validity and reliability may not hold up. We can't assume that just because the instrument was tested and found to be valid and reliable with this certain population or with these certain items on the survey, we can't assume that that same validity and reliability will hold up if we start changing the survey. So if we add or take things away from the survey, or if we use it with a completely different population that the validity and reliability hasn't been tested with. So keep that in mind. You might, if you do that, if you change the instrument enough or change the population you're using the instrument with, then you might be at square one, the same as if you were developing your own instrument. So if you get to that point, then you may want to just develop your own instrument anyways, because you don't have the benefit of the past validity and reliability scores of that instrument. When you're writing about your instrumentation, you might include a couple sample items from the instrument to give the reader a sense of what is the format of the questions or what type of questions are being asked. You'll indicate the major content sections in the instrument. So major content sections meaning like, is there an instruction section, a cover letter that is explaining how to proceed, how to complete the instrument, why you're completing the instrument, how to interpret what's in the instrument. Then a section about the items. So demographics, attitude, behavior, factual items, whatever might be included in that section. And then are there closing instructions, like what should they do next, or how do they submit their survey, or how do they follow up, that sort of thing. And then you also want to include the scale or the explanation of how the responses to the survey will be calculated. So how will the final scores for that survey be calculated based on the scale that you're presenting here? Then you might need a pilot test or a field test to see You might need to develop the validity and reliability for your instrument, depending on if you changed something or if you developed your own. So you need to present your plan for how you're going to pilot test, or what experts you might share your instrument with to determine face validity or that sort of thing, and any steps for administering your instrument, especially if it's a mailed survey, because you might have more sort of methodology to develop there, like how many times are you going to mail it? Are you going to mail it to the whole group 3 times? But what if some of them already returned their surveys? So it gets a little bit more complex there, and you need to include your methodology and how you plan to administer that mailed survey. Okay, then for data analysis, you will need to communicate your plan for your data analysis. So we use computer programs to do the analysis. It makes it significantly easier. SPSS is a really common program for this purpose, but there are also other ways to do it depending on how in-depth your statistics needs to be. Like Excel can do actually a lot of data analysis, just it's not as advanced and in-depth as SPSS and other programs. So the data analysis steps for a survey. Step 1, you need to count how many of your participants, so how many of the people that you sent your survey to or invited to complete the survey, how many completed it and how many didn't. So if you sent an email with a link to your electronic survey to 1,000 people and 300 respond and 700 didn't, for example. So you need those numbers so you know what your response rate is, and to see if you had enough people respond to be able to draw statistically significant conclusions. So did you have strong enough power? And then step 2, you need a method for determining response bias. So is there a certain item on your survey where maybe you expected a certain response or a certain range of responses, and it seems like more people than should have answered a certain way on that question? Reflect on that item and see, like, is there a way that maybe your population might have been misinterpreting the meaning of the question, or maybe the right answer that they would have selected could have been embarrassing, or they don't want to admit to themselves or to the researcher that this other answer was really correct. So there might be some reason, some bias that participants had that led them to strongly answer it in a certain way. And so you want to make sure you can identify those and discard them, because you don't want that to skew your analysis. Then step 3, you need to plan to provide descriptive analyses. So that's pretty basic stuff: mean, median, mode, range, that sort of thing. So just a kind of a summary of the results of your survey. You want to calculate total scale scores. And then step 5, you need a plan for your inferential statistical analyses. So that's where things get a little bit more complicated, and where things get more interesting, because that's where you're using the data that you've collected to make predictions and generalizations about the broader population where you drew your sample from. So things get more complicated and definitely more interesting. It's kind of the more meaningful part of your study. And then step 6, you need a way to make sense of that data for the reader. So you'll present the results in figures or tables, and you need to work on interpreting that data. So then you need to interpret the results and write your discussion section in light of that interpretation. So you want to report how the results answer the research question or hypothesis. So were your hypotheses accepted or rejected, and in what way, how so? So you're going to discuss that. You'll give practical evidence in terms of the effect size. So if you did find a relationship, how big was that relationship? How strong was that relationship between variables? And then how confident are you in that effect? Okay, so what is the confidence interval? How certain are you that what you found was accurate? Then you want to discuss the implications of the results. So how does that apply? So maybe it's in a clinical setting. So how does that apply to how a clinician might interact with patients or a treatment that they might administer? Or maybe the implications are academic or social or in some other area in research, or so you want to discuss whatever the implications are for the results that you found and compare your results and your conclusions with what has been found by other authors in previous studies. So maybe your study supports what has been found by other authors in similar areas. Maybe it refutes that evidence. Maybe it builds on. So you want to discuss how the results of your study fit in the context of the landscape of the literature in your area of study. All right, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you for the next video.